I am Sarah Hamilton-Buxton. I am an employee of the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I partner closely with NRCS throughout North Dakota and eastern Montana. So Lena and I are co-presenting today. I'll kick us off talking about the importance of pollinators and beneficial insects, and talk you through a few examples of beneficial insects that you might not have realized are doing some really great work for us. And then I will hand it over to Lena, and she will talk more specifically about implementing and creating habitat for these creatures. So, invertebrates are important, but it's so easy for us as humans to take them for granted. They're small. We don't really think of them maybe throughout our daily lives, but they are certainly really important to us. On top of that, we often suffer from a few bad apples, giving the whole group a bad name. Maybe when you think of bugs, you think of the ones that we don't like: mosquitoes, ticks, the bad spiders, fleas. The list can go on and on. But in reality, only a small fraction of insects are considered pests, just about 2%. So the overwhelming majority of invertebrates are beneficial to us humans, or they're important to our food webs. And also, the invertebrate world is just hugely diverse, a huge group of animals. So to say that invertebrates are the little things that run the world might sound like a major overstatement, but if you stop and think about it for just a minute, it starts to make sense. Sorry about that, it advanced without me hitting anything. So what's some things that invertebrates and insects do for us? Well, they provide two really important ecosystem services for us. They provide plant pollination, so they move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower and allow those plants to set seed and reproduce. Oftentimes, the plants that we are really interested in are our crops, but certainly they also promote terrestrial plants reproduction. So they're important to our crop systems and to just our ecosystems. Also, there's a whole group of insects called beneficial insects that offer free pest control services to us. They are insects that are specialized in predating or feeding on prey species, and those prey species are often crop pests. We also have parasitoid beneficial insects, and we will get into that in a few more slides. No news to any of us that bugs are great bird food. So our game birds that we really like to eat, like our introduced pheasant or our native grouse, all the way to songbirds, these invertebrates are providing really important piece of the food web. And then they also help us recycle nutrients throughout the ecosystem, either by breaking down leaf litter and dead materials like that, or the dung beetle, which is always a great thing to have on a ranch. They are literally out there burying cow manure into the soil. They are literally recycling that, the nutrients from the manure into the soil. So they do a lot of great things for us. But again, they're small and it's easy to take for granted. So specifically looking at how they impact our daily diets and our human nutrition, again, pollinators are providing that important ecosystem service of allowing plants to set seed and reproduce. So 35% of our crop production worldwide relies on pollinators in order to produce. $18 to $27 billion annually is generated in crops in the US alone on pollinator-dependent crops. And that number has certainly increased lately with inflation. And then a lot of our vitamins and minerals that we need in our diet come from the fruits and vegetables that we would not have if it weren't for pollinators. So in this instance, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words here. So here's a picture of the produce section that we're all used to walking into a grocery store and seeing. There is abundant options, many different fruits and vegetables to choose from. There's also abundant quantity. If you want a red apple, you have 100 or 200 to choose from just right there in this one store. But if we are to take away pollinators, if they just blink out overnight, this is what our produce section is reduced to. We have lost apples, avocado, eggplant, strawberry, blueberry, blackberry, raspberry, squash, pumpkins. The list keeps going. I always like to point out with pumpkins, not only is that something we enjoy eating in the fall, but there's a cultural element to that as well. A lot of us enjoy carving pumpkins in the fall. So the produce section would be impacted greatly if we lose pollinators. Three other important items that you don't find in the produce section, but certainly a lot of us use on a daily basis, are chocolate, tea, and coffee. And we would not have those three products if we didn't have pollinators. Another part of the grocery store that is impacted by pollinators, but it might not seem as obvious at first, is the dairy aisle. Our dairy cattle are fed high quality hay, alfalfa, and other legumes. Well, those plants need pollinators in order to reproduce. So without pollinators, the produce section is reduced to this. We've lost a lot of quantity of our dairy items. We've also lost a lot of the flavorings that we've come to really enjoy in dairy items. Like think of strawberry or chocolate milk. A lot of the flavorings we like in our yogurts, like vanilla, strawberry, blackberry, blueberry, none of that would be possible without pollinators. So one way to kind of summarize this in a really broad stroke manner is to say that about 1 in every 3 bites of food and drink that we consume requires a pollinator. Now, certainly that varies. You know, what I eat is different than what you eat on a daily basis, but just to help kind of capture this idea, 1 in every 3 bites needs a pollinator. Yet, pollinators are declining. This is probably not earth-shattering news. This is in the news a lot, and certainly in the natural resource world, we hear about how pollinators are declining. Here is just a few titles of scientific papers that have documented this dramatic decline. And so there's overwhelming evidence that we are losing pollinators in both our managed pollinator species, so like honeybees, and then also our wild native pollinators. So that then begs the question, why? What's happening to make them drop in their numbers so much? And like most ecological questions, it's not terribly straightforward. It's complex, and there's a lot of different reasons why. So the way to think of it is really death by 1,000 cuts. They're losing habitat as we convert open space, natural spaces to farmland or to urban development. Even pulling out maybe some marginal land for agriculture and putting that into crop production can have impacts on pollinators. Thinking specifically of an example like tree rows, as we grow our field sizes or increase our field sizes and we pull out those tree rows, that actually does have an impact on pollinators. Those tree rows can provide really important overwintering spaces for these creatures. So, you know, as habitat is converted to different land uses, we lose plant diversity across the landscape, and that certainly impacts these animals. Pesticide use also contributes to their declines. And we use pesticides not just in our agricultural systems, but in our towns and cities as well, for things like mosquito control, to help control a mosquito-borne illness, and for other reasons that maybe are more of a societal expectation, like in our home and garden uses. We all tend to think about needing a really monoculture, bright green lawn, and a lot of times it requires chemical to achieve that. And then again, certainly, you know, we use pesticides in our agricultural systems as well. Disease also is a threat to our pollinators as we move our managed pollinator species, like our honeybees, around the country. It moves disease around. It increases the risk of spreading disease as well. So in the honeybee industry, in the wintertime, most honeybees are collected down in the almond orchards of California, and they're down there doing hard work, busy work, pollinating that almond crop. Well, in the summer, I'm sure a lot of you probably know that a lot of honeybees come up here to the northern Great Plains. So that's, again, kind of a perfect storm of concentrating a lot of bees in one area where they can maybe be more susceptible to disease, and then we're spreading them across the country, where they can then sometimes pass on disease to our native bees. Invasive plant species also poses a threat to these creatures. Perfect example is Kentucky bluegrass on our rangelands up here. As Kentucky bluegrass encroaches, it drives plant diversity down. We lose a lot of our flowers or forbs that these animals need for pollen and nectar, and that certainly impacts pollinators as well. And then also there is a competition element between honeybees and our native pollinators. If there's 100 flowers blooming at a given time, and we have both honeybees and native bees in that same area, then, you know, there's only 100 flowers for all of them to feed on. So when I say the term pollinators, it does really require a little bit of clarification, because sometimes people will use the term pollinators to actually mean the plants that the insect pollinators need. So like the flowers. But when I personally say pollinators, I am talking about the invertebrate pollinators. There are a couple of vertebrate pollinators like bats and hummingbirds, but by far and away, the majority of pollinators are invertebrates, insects. And of those insect pollinators, there's 6 main groups. There's bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. And of those 6 groups, by far and away, the most efficient, the most effective group of pollinators are bees. They're just built for moving pollen around. They have really fine hairs. A lot of them are covered all over their body, so they're just really great at moving pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. So a lot of folks may not realize that we actually have almost 3,600 species of native bees in the US alone. And when you add Canada and Mexico, we reach 5,000 species of native bees in North America. And that includes a wide diversity of species, things like small carpenter bees, large carpenter bees, green metallic sweat bees, cuckoo bees, bumblebees, longhorned bees. The list really goes on and on. But one species that you didn't hear me mention in that list of native bees is our honeybee. Honeybees are actually not native to the US, and some folks don't realize that. They are actually a European species. They were brought over to North America in the 1620s when Europeans came over. They wanted their honey, so they brought their honeybees with them. Certainly nothing wrong with honeybees. I love honey as much as the next person, but it is important from a natural resource perspective to recognize that honeybees are managed for very differently than our native pollinators. So my best example here is that honeybees are to our native pollinators like chickens are to our native grouse. They are a domesticated species. They are managed for what us humans want, and they have been bred for disease and pesticide resistance. Okay, so that was a bit about our pollinators. Let's turn for just a minute to our beneficial insects. This is a group of animals that you might not have heard as much about as pollinators, but they're out there doing some really cool work for us through that ecosystem service of pest control. So you might have also heard beneficial insects called natural enemies or biocontrol agents. So what's some examples of these beneficial insects? There are several big categories here that I'll walk you through. But again, just keep in mind that in the invertebrate world, there's just a huge diversity. So we're talking about a lot of different species that fall within these categories. We have insect predators, and they are commonly generalists. They're not too picky about what they eat. So think of our vertebrate predators that we're more accustomed to thinking of, our wolves, bears. They're very skilled hunters, and they're not terribly picky about what they may go for. Same in the insect world, just on a much smaller scale. We have predators that are really efficient at hunting down their prey, and they're not terribly picky. So that's a great animal to have around when we're trying to help control insect pest species. Insect parasitoids is another group of animals that are really fascinating. And so I will take a second here to explain the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid. We're probably all familiar with the term parasite, but parasitoid is maybe a new one. So a parasite, like a tick, for example, will harm its host, but it doesn't outright kill it. And you may think, well, what if someone gets sick from a tick-borne illness? Yes, in that case, the host might die, but it wasn't the tick bite, it wasn't the tick that killed it, it was the disease that was brought in by the tick. So that's a parasite, does not outright kill its host, but a parasitoid does. And we will get into that in a few slides on how they go about doing that. But they will hunt down their prey and eventually kill them. We have non-insect beneficial insects as well, like spiders, harvestmen, which is just a fancy word for daddy longlegs, centipedes, and we also have predatory mites and nematodes. And I always smile when I mention mites and nematodes because, again, that's a perfect example of where we often think of those two groups as pest species, but there actually are beneficial mites and nematodes as well. And then also, some of our beneficial insects also are pollinators. They might be predatory in their larval stage, but then in their adult stage, they are actually pollinators. So they are even better. They help control pests as larvae, and then they are pollinators, moving pollen around for us as adults. And typically those groups would be the flies, the wasps, and the beetles. So to just give you a few examples of some of these animals, the ladybug. We're all so familiar with this animal, but we might not realize the pest services that they are providing to us. So up here in the top left, we have a larvae of a ladybug. They are predatory during all of their life stages, so they are feeding on things like aphids, mites, whiteflies, scale, other soft-bodied insects, and eggs throughout their life cycle, both as larvae and as adults. And this is amazing to me that one ladybug, one little guy, can consume as many as 5,000 aphids in their lifetime. And certainly, typically when you see one ladybug, there's a lot more around. Adults do also feed on pollen and nectar, so it's important that they have flowers around so that they can help complete their life cycle in that adult stage. So they're feeding on pollen and nectar as adults, and they are also feeding on prey. And here's where I mentioned those tree rows earlier. Overwintering habitat is so important, especially here where our winters are so harsh. And that can be something as simple as just leaf litter that has been left from fall through to spring, or rock piles can help provide cover for these animals. Bark, undisturbed soil, all of that provides really important overwintering habitat that we might not think of as doing much good, but it actually does. Another predatory beneficial insect is fireflies, or I grew up calling them lightning bugs, and I still do. But they are actually beetles. They're not flies at all. They're beetles. You'll find them in more of our moist habitats, and they prey on large snails, slugs, and caterpillars. And that's pretty handy because those are three groups of prey species that a lot of the other beneficial insects that we have don't necessarily gravitate towards. So fireflies or lightning bugs are great to have around. And certainly we all have probably memories of catching lightning bugs. So they're just a really cool species to watch light up at night too. Again, just like ladybugs, adult lightning bugs will feed on nectar and pollen. So having a flower in their habitat, having that bloom, the flower species nearby and in their habitat is really important to help them complete their life cycle. And this is a picture of a larvae of lightning bugs. Okay, lacewings are another common predator. You might not have heard of them, but now that I have shown you a picture of an adult lacewing here, just kind of lock that away in your brain. And if you keep an eye out for insects this growing season, you will start to be a bit impressed at how many lacewings you will see around. In backyards, in rural settings, they are really common and they're great to have around. Here is their larvae. A picture of the larvae, and they can consume up to 400 aphids or more in a week. Some adult lacewings are predaceous and others are pollinators, but their prey that they typically feed on are aphids, caterpillars, insect eggs, and mites. Again, the adults need pollen and nectar, so that flower component is really important for their habitat, and they overwinter in leaf litter, soil, and under bark. So just having some undisturbed area is really important for them. Also importantly for lacewings is they tend to be more active in cool weather than a lot of our other beneficial insects. So again, they're great to have around in our cold weather environment. Another predator are flower flies. There's three names for these guys: flower flies, hover flies, or syrphid flies. Highly predaceous larvae. A single larvae can eat hundreds of aphids in a week, pictured here. And then the adult is a pollinator. They feed on pollen and nectar. And you might look at this picture and think, oh, that looks like a bee. And it certainly does. This is also, I love to talk about these little guys because they also are a great example of mimicry. They have become adapted to look like bees just to kind of give a warning to predators like, hey, you don't want to bother me. I have a stinger. But in fact, they don't have the ability to sting. And the way that you can identify them, maybe this growing season, if you're interested, are these fly eyes. So if you glance at first and you think, oh, that's a honeybee, take a second look and see if you see these fly eyes that we're all so accustomed to seeing in our houseflies. And you might start to develop an eye for just how many flower flies or hover flies you have around. And again, they can be a really common beneficial insect. And importantly, they need that leaf litter or undisturbed soil to overwinter in. Also, tree rows are really helpful for these guys because they don't have as much of a tolerance for high winds, which is not very convenient here in North Dakota. But if they can have a little bit of protection from wind, then they can be more active even on those windy days. Okay, so here are our parasitoid beneficial insects. So when I describe this, I've heard people say, like, this sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie, and it really kind of is. Maybe a bit gruesome, but highly effective group of pest control animals. So how do parasitoids operate? Well, the adult parasitoid insect will hunt down its prey and then lay her eggs or inject them into the body of the prey, so its host species. And then those eggs will stay in the body of the prey, and then when they hatch, they will eat that prey from the inside out. So they eat and kill their prey. And I have heard many entomologists say that for every pest species we have out there, there's a parasitoid wasp species that specializes in hunting down that pest species. So they're highly effective with pest control, and a really diverse group as well. And also parasitoid wasps are incredibly tiny. So another really easy group of animals to take for granted because we just don't see them. So we know that pollinators and beneficial insects are important animals for us. They're out there doing really critical work for us, and they need our help. Their numbers are declining. So it's important that when possible, we provide habitat for them so they can continue to do that really great work for us. Cover crops certainly can provide important food and habitat resources for these animals. However, when we are planning and planting beneficial insect and pollinator habitat, we do have to consider a few things that maybe folks don't think about as much when we're talking about vertebrate wildlife species. It's important to consider proper plant material for the site. When possible, using native plants is helpful because that's what these animals are adapted to. But that's not always a requirement. But you also have to consider the site and if the flowers that you want to plant are even going to be able to grow in the soil types that you have, in the region that you have, and in the moisture conditions of that site. And then also pesticide risk and mitigation just really has to be considered and thought through carefully when establishing habitat, because if you're trying to attract these animals to a certain area, it's important to protect that area from pesticide. Otherwise, you're bringing them into a great habitat only for them to be killed by insecticide drift, perhaps, or if herbicide drift gets in there, it could knock out the flowers that they really need. So one quick example of a cover crop increasing pest control on a farm before I hand it over to Lena. This is an example from down in Georgia on a soybean field where they planted cover crops, buckwheat specifically, and allowed it to flower near the soybeans. And in doing so, that bloom attracted a parasitoid wasp. Over here, you can see just how incredibly tiny we are talking about. But this is a parasitoid wasp that is laying her eggs into these stink bug eggs. And in doing that, and bringing this parasitoid wasp in, attracting them into the area, it increased, the parasitism of the stink bug eggs was increased 2.5-fold. And with that, I will hand it over to Lena.
Now that we've seen the doom and gloom of what happens when we lose our predators and when we lose our beneficial insects, and now that you know who are some of our beneficials too, what can we do for them? Next. That's where you, along with conservation planners, can actually make an impact. Maybe a small thing, and our insects are really small, but we can do a lot just by small things we do in our own planning procedures. So let's look at the backbone of how we get there. And for me, what I do, I normally focus that on from the 9 steps of planning, because often a farmer or rancher will come into the office or come to me and they will look at, they have a problem. They're trying to identify that problem. And so I'll take that and I'll look at what's the problem, and then I want to determine what's that person's objectives. So as I go through those steps of the process, that helps me try to determine what their objectives are, and then to start looking at what do they already have for resources. And if we already know, and once we find out their resources, looking at what they have for soils, we can look at what they already have for habitat there, what does their operation already consist of. Now we can analyze with that resource data and analyze what they have already there and what we need to try to come up with. And from there, we'll formulate some alternatives, and we'll try to evaluate those alternatives to figure out what's going to be the best practices to put in place, what's the best ways to develop this habitat for what their problem is, And then the client gets to decide what they want to do. And they implement their practices and their conservation plan. And then we go back to the drawing board as we evaluate it to see, was it successful or was it not successful? And sometimes it's not as successful as we hope. So we end up having to start over again. So next, now we take our client's objectives and be it a backyard conservation, or be it in a city lot, or if we're looking at a cropland scenario, or even if it's a one field of an 80 to 100 acre field that we're looking at, or be it something that's a 10,000 acre operation. Sometimes it's pasture and rangeland uses. There's several different resource concerns that we are actually looking at. And the client's objectives normally coincide with what the resource concerns are already there. And so we'll see common resource concerns throughout. Some of those common resource concerns, be it in a backyard or in a cropland or rangeland scenario, include soil quality. There's often compaction happening. There might be degraded plant conditions that are occurring. There could be indiscriminate pesticide use. There might be erosion happening. And more often than not is the terrestrial habitat. There's the lack of food and shelter. How many of you have ever gone out and you stopped and listened and you didn't even hear the crickets? You don't hear anything making a sound. In my mind, that is actually our first eye-opener to stop and think about what's going on in our operation. I know all morning we've been talking about cover crops and no-till and trying to incorporate all these things into our operation, when sometimes just remembering the key little things, remembering to mimic nature as much as possible, can actually help us get there. So next. And of course, me as a planner, I always get hooked by the farmer or rancher or the producer or the landowner that comes in and says, hey, I want to plant an area down to conservation or for pollinator habitat. We need to do more for the bees. We need to do something for these guys. I've seen these waves of flowers, and I want all kinds of flowers in my yard. Or they'll tell me, show me everything I can do for the monarchs, so the monarchs are disappearing. Or they'll come in, they're like, I just took over this land. I want a bunch of wildlife habitat. I want to do this. And next. Then they throw in the line that I heard pollinator habitat will help me score better on my application. Or I've got this perfect spot to finally implement some trees so they're out of the way and we can put a pollinator plot over here. And next, then I finally get the true reality. You get out to the site, because in my work, when you go out to a site, you got to take a look at it. And normally the perfect spot that most landowners bring into me is a wetland, or it's a saline area where there's a bunch of salt crystals linking up at me, or all the topsoil is completely gone. And it's to the point where, should it even be planted? What can we do to it? So it's like, by the time it normally comes to me, it's already been destroyed, or it's been like so degraded. And next, what we will do is look at what's the soils. And I don't give up. That's the other thing. As a planner and as a landowner, you don't give up. You as a farmer, if you have a failure, are you going to give up? If you plant cover crops, it doesn't succeed one time, are you going to give up? Are you going to stop growing wheat just because wheat midge came in one year? No, you keep trying, and that's the same as a planner. So we're going to look at the soils. We're going to review the history, what happened on this operation, what's been going on here, what's going on with this specific location. Is there a lot of water ponding here? Has there been a high water tables going on? What's the weather cycle that's been happening? Or even what's the grazing system? What's the crop rotation? Is it a backyard play area? Is it an old manure pit? Is it a farmstead that's been reclaimed? We don't know until we start looking into it. And then we start asking the questions of the client, or as asking you as a landowner, what's your plans for the area? What do you want to do with it? What is your long-term goal, short-term goals? And then what can we do to help the resources that we have right now? How can we capture that carbon? How can we try to start rebuilding that soil and regenerating it? And honestly, we have to be realistic. Some of those areas are not meant to be pollinator habitat. Some of those areas are just meant to be planted back to grass, maybe thin grass if we can get that established. Next. So if you hadn't guessed, we're optimistic We're always optimistic. Why is this such a tough area to plant in? What happened to it? Can we heal it? What are we going for? Is it a visual perspective? Is it aesthetics that we want? Do we want to enhance the ecological needs there? And why does the producer want the planting? How can we accomplish what we truly want here? And the other thing is as a planner, we need to be honest with you as a landowner or an operator, why this may or may not work. We may succeed, we may fail. That's just the true reality of it. Next. But when we stop and think about the beneficial insects and the critters that we're not hearing out there, we know that there's 4 main things they need to succeed. They need habitat. They need something, a place for locally, and they need protection where they are. Second thing they need is they need a food source. They need to be able to get forage. They need to be able to have food to eat. And they need growing seasons that match with their needs and with their life cycles. The third thing they need is they need water, not just to drink, but they need fresh, clean water with easy access for bathing and temperature control. And they need space. Believe it or not, some of these beneficial insects are just a little territorial for some reason. And they need proximity to their needed resources. They need those resources. So let's look at that base location. You're looking on cropland. We've been talking about cover crops. That's a main thing that we want to think about. And also I've heard it throughout this morning, but I've also heard it through the years. Monocultures are not the solution, but that's what we often go to so often. But monocultures are unnatural. And so if you have a monoculture, how many of your beneficials are going to still stick around? And all those native insects are not going to always be there. But the pest insects, the ones we don't want, they will move in as soon as it becomes a monoculture. They seem to find their way. So the more we can mimic nature in our landscape, and the better we do that, the better outlook we'll have for our beneficials. And if you want to take that poor saline area, you want to stop and think about what you're doing. So when you're planting on cropland, you want to think about your conservation crop rotation. Do you just have a corn, soybean, wheat rotation? Do you just have a wheat on wheat rotation? What can you incorporate into that conservation crop rotation when you're working with a producer or a farmer or rancher? Can you incorporate some flax? Do they have stuff in their operation to include canola or sunflowers? That will add that flowering component. Another thing to look at is can they incorporate cover crops? And if they do incorporate cover crops, I know we've talked a lot about winter rye, which is a great source, but what about some flowering ones? Like we saw the information about buckwheat. Buckwheat is a wonderful pollinator and it's a wonderful annual crop, and so is Lacey Facilia. And there's many different annual clovers the same way, and they're great for forage for cattle too. So there's a mixture of things you can use them for. And I think Sarah kind of honed in on what a lot of these beneficials need. What do we see disappearing from our landscape? Windbreaks. The field windbreaks are disappearing, the trees are disappearing. How can we incorporate more of those trees back out into the landscape? And above all, remember that when we're thinking about pest management, it's not just the herbicides, not just the chemical component. We're also supposed to think about the cultural component and the biological component. And I know it's hard to get away from seed treatments, and it's sometimes hard to get away from insecticides, but if we try to help a producer and help someone realize how they can follow and only use it when they have to. Use it, wait until we actually get to that economic threshold where it's time to finally apply, rather than just applying indiscriminately because, well, my neighbor's spraying for wheat midge because, well, I probably better too. I better get that fungicide on because it's going to be a wet year when they didn't even stop and think about it. Next. And sometimes it's a native grass or it's an introduced grass or it's a perennial. That's the best thing we can do out there for that horrible area. So like when you look at that poor saline area and you're attempting to establish a grass seeding or trying to get something there, there are some plant materials we can utilize. And a lot of them are introduced, like green wheatgrass and western wheatgrass. But when you're working with salinity, sometimes what you want to do is just get something growing out there again, get that plant material growing. And there are some different types of forbs that you can incorporate into there that are a little more tolerant of some salinity. The alfalfas and clovers are a little more tolerant. And the thing to remember is when you're dealing with salinity, you're dealing with water management. So you're managing that water. And if you want managing that water, you might want to have something with a deep taproot like alfalfa to actually go down in there to pull it up. But some of the other native forbs like blanket flower, prairie coneflower, purple prairie clover. They're all great different forms for pollinators. They hit on some of the different growing seasons and blooming seasons, but they also are a little more, they're not real tolerant, but they're a little more tolerant than some of the others when it comes to salinity. So let's next look at a case study that we put in about 4 or 5 years ago in Renville County. It was one of my first hook lines and sinkers, because the hook lines and sinkers come in and they'll tell you, it's like, I've got this great idea, got this great place, got this great location. And this was a producer who came in, he was done putting down pesticides. He told me all about how pesticides and herbicides are so bad for the environment, they're so bad for human health, they're so bad for everything. So he wanted to figure out a way to reduce that. He said, I need more pollinator habitat. I'm like, well, where do you want pollinator habitat? He goes, I got the perfect location. This is what he gave me. And you'll see on the far side, it's kind of a weird map picture I have there. But what happened is it turned out it was a wetland and saline. So I hit 2 of the things and I'm going, it's a problem child already. What do you want me to do with this? But I was optimistic and we stopped and looked at it and we realized there was something we could do here. So we thought about what the pollinators needed and what types of plants we want to put in there. And we also looked at the soils. Of course, we based everything on the soils. And we figured out that with the soils, we could actually, where that area is in the middle, that's like that double hump, that was our pollinator planting. That's the one that got the whole 70% grasses of native grasses, actually a little blue stem and green needle grass. We include side oats grama, Canada wild rye, and then we had 30% forbs. We did do some alfalfa in there. It's not native, but we're trying to make sure we're hitting all the blooming seasons. And so we include blanket flower and black-eyed Susan and Lewis flax. And in fact, I think this was one of the first ones Sarah got stuck helping me with as we were trying to come up with a mix. And then we added a buffer. So where you see that straight line, that's a road. To the west of the pollinator planting is a buffer, as she's showing. And that buffer we actually seeded to just for a saline, because it was a saline area. So we included slender wheatgrasses and western wheatgrass and alfalfa and green wheatgrass. And the cropland to the further west, the producer makes a conscientious effort not to apply any herbicides or any other types of chemical when things are blooming or when the insects are the most active. He's trying to be protected. And we also paid attention to the east side. So the other side of the road, that's that's actually there's like a 50 to 75 foot buffer of grass that's already established, and a tree row, which happened to be a nice protection from the east side from potential drift from other sprays. So it turned into a nice planting. It got established about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was one that I would say is probably a success for now, and hoping we can see more of those happen in the future. But like I said, we considered where we were planting it because we want to protect those beneficials and those pollinators from potential spray. So in our next slide, like I go into, is we touched on some perennials, but we also have a lot of different annuals that you can look at for flowering. So some different flowering ones we include, you can see our common cash crops include sunflowers, canola, flax, and even soybeans flower. They sometimes can have benefits from the beneficials. The other thing is our cover crops. Think about a lot of those different vetches, those different clovers, and then also lacy phacelia, buckwheat, or some other annual cover crops that you include in your mix. Red clover is another one that we really like seeing. And then think about your growing season when you're planting it. Even radish and turnip, if it's a season long, it's given the opportunity, it will start to bloom. Our ideal pollinator planting locations next that we look at really gets into, we want to make sure that it's downwind of our windrows, our field breaks. We want to make sure it's in a protected area. Another good place for putting pollinator habitat is in yard areas adjacent to rangeland, so they've got more areas to be able to get more resources. And even in our odd areas that are difficult to access but are protected from pesticides. Next. Managing pesticide risks can be a challenge, but you want to consider the pesticide drift. You want to think about what you're establishing. And if there's cropland right beside it, you may want to think about, like, if you're going to establish habitat, make sure that the woody vegetation has a barrier and separate, like a non-habitat vegetation barrier from your flowering habitat for your pollinators. And if at all possible, which I don't know if this is ever possible, you can try to apply or plant your pollinator plantings where there's no aerial spraying happening, but that's hit or miss. So there we have focused more on the perennials and in cropland, but even in your backyard, even your tree species, the trees are a great way to try to establish an early season planting, or something that blooms early for when the beneficials and when the early pollinators are first coming up, when they're first emerging. And so this is another case study that we did where it's essentially, we made sure that we have windward rows that are protecting the pollinator planting from the actual cropland. There's a whole mix of trees in there, but it's also there to try to help add wind protection for those forgotten pollinator species. There's snowdrift is protected, and there's a lot of cover, and the conifers are there to help with protecting it from this drift as well. Within the pollinator planting that you see, pollinator planting is actually just a square right down where I have it labeled as pollinator planting. And there's short rows there of golden currants and common lilac, cranberry bush, black chokeberry, and crab apples. And then in between the rows, we planted grass, including blue grama and purple prairie clover, so that we had another blooming season. And we were trying to make sure we had food there for when they're first emerging, but also food there as they go through the summer. And then they can go out to different locations where we have another planting. But we provide beneficial invertebrates, we provide habitat for the beneficial invertebrates, the early pollinator food source, and we're trying to make sure that we focus on that drift protection. Next. And I know we talked about the tougher tree varieties some, and with the tougher tree varieties, there's, like, if you're dealing with salinity, silver buffaloberry and sea buckthorn may be able to be successful there. But when you're dealing with pesticide drift, you want to consider planting a non-flowering windbreak upwind of the blooming trees, and maybe adding a grass buffer, like a 50 to 75 foot buffer between the flowering shrubs. Next. I know I'm running out of time. Next. So as you can see from the pictures back in the last slide, and now as we talked about, there are many common conservation practices we do look at. Sometimes, like we talked about, planting a grass, that would include conservation cover, where you can get some permanent ground covers established, using native and introduced grasses and forbs. You want to think about your bloom times of the plants and the forbs that are blooming. You want to make sure you have shelter areas and you have a form of weed management, and also consider the longevity of your forbs that you're planting. If you plant buffers, we can think about incorporating cover crops and windbreaks, and of course integrated pest management into our practices. Next. But like we also talked about, and Sarah brought up, there's other common practices we need to think about too. It's like when you have those tough areas in your inventory, what you have for resources, do you have that rock pile out there? Do you have those beetle banks? Do you have the brush piles? Maybe it's okay to leave some of that there. What other kind of management can you do out there to help your animals, keep that place for things to overwinter? And last but not least is programs. There are always programs available. The most important thing is to come in and talk to someone, start talking these different, be it to your county agent, to come in and talk to your local soil conservation district, come in and talk to us at the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service. We probably have a program available to help you if you have some pollinator habitat or beneficial insect habitat you want to get established. Or even if you're just trying to establish what you want to get going on in your operation. And we'll do the planning with you, and then we'll find the funding sources, because there are funding sources available. And with that, I think it's our last slide. Thank you everyone for bearing with me, and I know we went pretty fast at the last minute there, and I don't know if we have much time for questions.